Zrak the Bone Crusher had a reputation that preceded him across 3 galaxies, 2-dimensional rifts, and one very unfortunate incident involving a space casino that nobody talked about anymore. Standing 8 feet tall, with scales that could deflect plasma bolts and teeth that made great white sharks look like house cats, he was the kind of being that made grown Klaxons wet themselves and caused entire Zephian colonies to suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. His ship, the Mercy's End, was a testament to his success in the bounty hunting business. Every surface was either weapon-grade titanium or covered in the trophies of his victims. The walls displayed enough alien skulls to stock a xenobiology museum, and his captain's chair was upholstered in genuine Altarian warhead. Because nothing said professional intimidation quite like sitting on something that used to eat starships for breakfast. So when his communication console chimed with an incoming contract, Zrak expected the usual fare. Some criminal mastermind holed up in an asteroid fortress, maybe a rogue AI that needed aggressive decommissioning, perhaps even a corrupt politician who'd forgotten that stealing from the galactic treasury was considered poor form. Instead, the holographic display showed him what appeared to be the easiest payday of his career. Human child. His employer's synthesized voice crackled through the speakers. The figure on screen was deliberately obscured because apparently evil masterminds had a dress code that required dramatic shadows and voice modulators. Age approximately 6 standard years. Currently located on mining station Omega-7 in the Outer Rim. Zrak leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his considerable bulk. A human child. He'd hunted down escaped super soldiers, rogue psychics, and, once memorably, a sentient gas cloud with anger management issues. This was barely worth firing up his engines. Payment, he rumbled, his voice carrying the kind of gravelly menace that made subtitles appear in horror movies. Million credits. Standard rate for live retrieval. Now that got his attention. 1 million credits for a human larva? Either this employer was stupidly wealthy or there was something special about this particular child. Zrak's predatory instincts, finely honed by decades of hunting the galaxy's most dangerous criminals, started pinging warning signals. What makes this child worth premium rates? He asked, studying the grainy photograph that had appeared on his screen. The image showed a small human female with bright eyes and what humans apparently called a smile. Zrak had seen that expression before, usually right before something exploded. Humans are unpredictable, the employer said, and something in that synthesized voice suggested personal experience. Exercise caution. Zrak's laugh sounded like boulders having an argument. Caution? Against a creature that probably weighed less than his smallest weapon? He'd faced down Thaxarian death knights and lived to tell about it. He'd stared into the collective consciousness of a hive mind and made it blink first. A tiny human couldn't possibly present any real challenge. Consider it done, he said, already calculating how he'd spend his easy million. Maybe he'd finally upgrade his ship's torture chamber. The current screaming echoes were getting a bit dated. As he set course for mining station Omega-7, Zrak allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Sometimes the universe handed you a gift. Sometimes the most feared predator in known space got to take a vacation while getting paid premium rates to collect what amounted to slightly aggressive cargo. He had no idea that he was about to encounter the most terrifying force in the galaxy, a human child who had absolutely nothing to lose and no concept of appropriate fear responses. The Mercy's End jumped to hyperspace, carrying its confident captain toward his destiny as the galaxy's most reluctant babysitter. Mining station Omega-7 was the kind of place that existed purely because someone had to extract rare minerals from incredibly inconvenient locations. It was a rust bucket facility held together by prayer, duct tape, and the sheer stubborn refusal of its inhabitants to admit they were living in a death trap. The perfect place to stash a human child, really. Remote, lawless, and with enough background radiation to scramble most tracking systems. Zrak docked his ship with the subtle grace of a meteor impact because when you were 8 feet of armored nightmare fuel, subtlety was for species that didn't have retractable claws. The airlock hissed open, and he stepped onto the station like death incarnate, having a particularly bad day. The effect was immediate and gratifying. Miners scattered like startled vermin, diving behind cargo containers and suddenly discovering urgent business in other sectors. A Vulcarian merchant took one look at Zrak's impressive collection of visible weapons and decided his shop needed to be closed for inventory. A drunk Centaurian actually sobered up on the spot, which medical science had previously deemed impossible. This was how it was supposed to work. fear, respect, and the kind of reputation that made people cooperate before you had to start breaking things. Zrakth allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction as he stalked through the corridors, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to have their own intimidation factor. He found the residential sector easily enough. According to his employer's intelligence, the human child was being kept in quarters 3B, probably under the care of some terrified station worker, who'd be only too happy to hand over their unwanted charge to avoid becoming a cautionary tale. Zrakth palmed the door control with enough force to crack the metal. The portal slid open with a mechanical wheeze, revealing a modest living space that smelled like recycled air and cheap protein paste. And there, sitting cross-legged on the floor with what appeared to be a collection of colorful data pads, was his target. She looked up at him with the kind of bright-eyed curiosity that should have immediately transformed into pants-wetting terror. Instead, she tilted her head to one side and said, "Wow, you're really big. Are you a dragon?" Zrakth blinked. His reputation had been built on targets who screamed, begged, or at least had the common courtesy to look appropriately terrified. This small human was studying him like he was some mildly interesting museum exhibit. "I am Zarek the Bone Crusher," he announced in his most menacing tone, the one that had caused hardened criminals to confess to crimes they hadn't even committed yet. "I have come for the human child." "That's me," she said cheerfully, popping to her feet with the kind of boundless energy that made adults everywhere suddenly understand why some species ate their young. "I'm Emma. Are you here to play? Nobody ever wants to play with me. They all say I ask too many questions, but how else are you supposed to learn things?" Zrakth felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: complete confusion. This was not how these encounters were supposed to go. Where was the cowering, the desperate bargaining, the satisfying sound of prey recognizing a superior predator? "You will come with me," he tried again, adding what he hoped was an appropriately threatening gesture with his claws. Emma's eyes lit up. "Are those real? Can I touch them? Do they hurt when they grow?" "My teeth fell out last month, but they grew back. Do yours do that too?" Before Zrakth could process what was happening, she had somehow crossed the room and was standing directly in front of him, reaching up toward his hands with the fearless curiosity of someone who had clearly never learned proper survival instincts. "Child," he rumbled, taking a step back because retreat seemed like the only sane option. "You should be afraid." Emma looked genuinely puzzled by this concept. "Why? You haven't hurt anybody. Plus, you have really cool armor. Is it heavy? I bet it's heavy. Do you want some juice? I have apple and grape, but the grape one is kind of weird." And somehow, inexplicably, Zrakth found himself being led toward a small kitchenette by a human barely tall enough to reach his knee, while she chattered about the relative merits of various fruit-flavored beverages. His carefully planned intimidation routine had been completely derailed by someone who appeared to think he was some sort of interactive entertainment. This was going to be a longer day than he'd anticipated. 20 minutes later, Zrakth found himself in a situation that would have destroyed his reputation if anyone had been recording it. He was sitting on the floor of a mining station quarters, holding a juice box in one massive claw, while a 6-year-old human explained the complex social dynamics of her stuffed animal collection. "So Mr. Whiskers is the leader because he's the oldest, but Sparkles thinks she should be in charge because she has wings, which is totally unfair because flying doesn't make you smart, right?" Emma was arranging her toys in what appeared to be some sort of military formation while she talked. "And Princess Fluffington is neutral because she's Swiss, which means she doesn't pick sides, but I think she's just scared of conflict." Drakdeath stared at the juice box in his hand. Apple flavor, as promised. He'd somehow been maneuvered into drinking it through a tiny straw that was clearly designed for species with significantly smaller fangs. The worst part was that it was actually quite refreshing. "Child," he began, then stopped because she was looking at him with that expectant expression that suggested she was genuinely interested in his opinion about stuffed animal politics. "Emma, we need to discuss your immediate future." "Oh, are you going to adopt me?" she asked with the casual directness that only children possessed. "Because that would be awesome. I've never had a dragon dad before. Do you eat people? Because I'm vegetarian now, but I could probably make exceptions for bad guys." The juice box crumpled in Zrakth's grip. "I am not adopting you. I am a bounty hunter. I collect people for money." "That sounds like a really lonely job," Emma said, tilting her head in that way that suggested she was genuinely thinking about his life choices, rather than being appropriately terrified by them. "Don't you get sad being by yourself all the time?" Zrakth opened his mouth to explain that predators didn't get sad, then closed it because something about the question felt like stepping on a conversational landmine. Instead, he tried to redirect. Your guardians. Where are they? Oh, they're dead, Emma said with the matter-of-fact tone children use to discuss everything from breakfast cereal to existential tragedy. Pirates got them last month. I've been staying with Mrs. Henderson, but she says I ask too many questions and make her nervous. Adults are weird about questions. Like, how else are you supposed to learn stuff? She was building something with colorful blocks now, her small hands moving with the kind of focused concentration that Zrakthn usually associated with demolitions experts. Are you going to take me somewhere fun? Because Mrs. Henderson never wants to go anywhere interesting. She says the universe is dangerous, but I think she's just boring. Zrakthn felt a strange sensation in his chest, like indigestion but more complicated. This human cub had just casually mentioned being orphaned by pirates, and somehow he was the one feeling uncomfortable about the situation. This was not how predator-prey dynamics were supposed to work. The person who hired me, he said carefully. What do you know about them? Emma looked up from her blocks. You mean the creepy voice guy? He says he's my uncle, but I don't have any uncles. Also, he smells wrong. Smells wrong? Yeah, like when milk goes bad, but tries to pretend it's still good. Adults have smells, you know, good ones and bad ones. You smell like metal and ozone and something kind of spicy. It's not bad. Mrs. Henderson smells like fear and antiseptic. The voice guy smells like lies. Zrakthn stared at her. In his centuries of hunting experience, he'd learned to trust his instincts about people, but he'd never met anyone who could literally smell deception. Especially not someone who was currently trying to balance a stuffed unicorn on a tower of blocks. Emma, he said slowly, do you want to come with me? She looked up, and for a moment her expression was far too serious for someone her age. Do I have a choice? The question hit him harder than it should have. Of course she didn't have a choice. That was the point of bounty hunting. You collected the target and delivered them to whoever was paying, regardless of what the target wanted. It was a simple transaction. So why did he suddenly feel like the worst kind of predator? You always have choices, he heard himself saying, which was possibly the first lie he'd told in decades. But sometimes the available options are all terrible. Emma nodded solemnly, like this was a perfectly reasonable philosophical position. That's very honest. I like that. Most adults lie to make kids feel better, but feeling better doesn't change reality, does it? She stood up and dusted off her hands. Okay, Zappy, I'll come with you, but I have conditions. Conditions? Zrakthn repeated. Child, you are not in a position to negotiate. Sure I am, Emma said cheerfully. You could just grab me and stuff me in a cage, but you haven't, which means you're either really bad at your job or you're a good person pretending to be scary, and good people always negotiate. She had somehow maneuvered him into a corner using nothing but logic and an alarming amount of insight. Zrakthn was beginning to understand why humans had such a troubling reputation across the galaxy. What conditions? He asked, because apparently he was now taking orders from someone who needed a step stool to reach door controls. Emma's smile was bright enough to power a small space station. First, I get to help with bounty hunter stuff because it sounds educational. Second, you have to answer my questions truthfully. And third, we stop for ice cream at least once a week because life without ice cream is just existence, and existence is boring. Zrakthn looked down at this small human who had somehow turned his simple extraction mission into a negotiation that would have impressed corporate lawyers, and realized he was completely out of his depth. Fine, he said, because what else could he say? But no touching the weapons. Deal, Emma said, sticking out her hand. Partners? And Zrakthn the Bone Crusher, terror of 3 galaxies, found himself shaking hands with a 6-year-old human who had just successfully recruited him as her sidekick. The next few hours were a masterclass in how a small human could completely reorganize a grown predator's worldview without even trying. Emma had insisted on giving Zrakthn the grand tour of Mining Station Omega-7, which apparently involved stopping at every maintenance junction to ask detailed questions about the engineering specifications and greeting every terrified resident like they were old friends. Hi, Mr. Gorblax, she called out to a Zephyri maintenance worker who immediately dropped his plasma torch and tried to hide behind a ventilation shaft that was considerably smaller than he was. This is my new friend Zappy. He's a bounty hunter, but don't worry, he's one of the good ones. Zrakthn watched the Zephyrian's eye stalks twitch in panic and felt an unfamiliar emotion that might have been embarrassment. Being introduced as one of the good ones by someone who reached approximately to his kneecap was doing strange things to his carefully cultivated reputation. "Emma," he said as they continued down the corridor, "perhaps we should discuss the concept of discretion?" "What's discretion?" she asked, skipping backwards so she could maintain eye contact while they walked. The fact that she could do this without running into anything suggested either remarkable spatial awareness or the kind of supernatural luck that made babysitters quit their jobs. "It means not telling everyone everything," Zracht explained. "Professional hunters maintain a certain mystery about their activities." "That sounds lonely," Emma said with the devastating simplicity that was becoming her trademark. "Don't you want people to know you're nice?" Before Zracht could explain that nice was not typically associated with his profession, the station's emergency klaxons began wailing, red lights flashed along the corridors, and the intercom crackled to life with a panicked voice. "All residents to emergency stations. We have a hull breach in Sector 7. Unknown hostile forces have boarded the station." Emma stopped skipping. That doesn't sound good. Zracht's predatory instincts, which had been lulled into confusion by juice boxes and philosophical discussions, suddenly snapped back online. His hand moved automatically to his weapon harness as he scanned the corridor for threats. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice dropping to the gravelly command tone that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. For once, Emma didn't argue. She moved closer to his massive frame, and Zrachtha felt a strange surge of protective instinct that had nothing to do with professional obligations. Someone was threatening his what, exactly? His cargo? His partner? His responsibility? The sound of plasma fire echoed from somewhere ahead, accompanied by screams and the distinctive crash of emergency barriers slamming shut. Whatever had boarded the station was moving fast and leaving chaos in its wake. "Zappy," Emma said quietly, and something in her voice made him look down. Her earlier cheerfulness had been replaced by a kind of alert stillness that reminded him uncomfortably of prey animals sensing predators. "The bad smell people are here." "Bad smell people. Like the voice guy, but more of them." Emma's small hand found the edge of his armor plating and gripped it tightly. "They're looking for me, aren't they?" Zrachtha felt something cold settle in his stomach. His employer hadn't mentioned that other parties might be interested in the child. Either this was a coincidence, which seemed unlikely, or he'd walked into a trap that was considerably more complex than a simple extraction job. The corridor ahead erupted in weapon fire, and 3 figures in black tactical armor rounded the corner at a dead run. They moved with the kind of coordinated precision that screamed military training, their weapons sweeping the area in practice search patterns. "Target acquired," one of them said into his comm unit. "Human child, accompanied by unknown alien, initiating retrieval protocol." They raised their weapons, and Zracht realized with crystal clarity that these people had no intention of leaving witnesses. The protective instinct that had been building all day suddenly crystallized into something much more dangerous: parental rage. "Emma," he said calmly, not taking his eyes off the approaching soldiers, "remember how I said you couldn't touch the weapons?" "Yeah." "Rules change. When I say run, you go to my ship. The access code is 7742. Lock yourself in the main cabin and don't come out until I get there." "What about you?" Zracht's laugh was the sound that had given nightmares to beings across 3 galaxies. "I'm going to remind these people why they should have done their research before threatening my partner." The lead soldier fired first, a plasma bolt that would have taken Zracht's head off if he hadn't spent decades learning to read combat intentions. He moved with the fluid grace of a born predator, his massive frame somehow finding cover behind a support pillar while his own weapon cleared its holster. "Run!" he roared. Emma ran, but not in the direction he'd expected. Instead of heading for the docking bay, she ducked into a maintenance access tunnel that Zracht's bulk couldn't possibly fit through, which meant she was either following some escape plan he didn't know about, or she was trusting him to handle the immediate threat while she implemented some typically human solution to their problem. The soldiers advanced with professional competence, using cover and coordinated fire to pin him down. They were good, Zracht thought had to admit. Probably ex-military, definitely experienced, and equipped with weapons that could actually hurt him. Unfortunately for them, they had made one critical tactical error. They had threatened someone under his protection. Zaraktha the Bone Crusher hadn't earned his reputation by being subtle. He exploded from cover with the kind of devastating violence that made other predators reconsider their career choices. His return fire turned the corridor into a light show of plasma bolts and ricocheting energy, while his massive frame closed the distance with terrifying speed. The first soldier went down to a combination of plasma fire and what medical professionals would later describe as catastrophic blunt force trauma. The second managed to get off 3 shots before discovering that Zracht's armor was considerably more effective than his own. The third actually wounded him, a lucky shot that burned through his shoulder plating and left him bleeding green ichor onto the deck plates. But wounded predators were more dangerous than healthy ones, and by the time the corridor fell silent, Zracht was standing alone among the debris, breathing heavily and trying to process what had just happened. He had killed 3 people to protect a human child he'd known for less than a day. More than that, he had enjoyed it in a way that had nothing to do with professional satisfaction and everything to do with the kind of fundamental protective rage that he'd thought was beyond him. "Zappy!" Emma's voice came from somewhere in the walls, transmitted through the station's internal communications system. "Are you okay? That sounded really loud." "I'm fine," he called back, surprised to discover that he was. The wound in his shoulder was painful but not serious, and the strange warm feeling in his chest was growing stronger. "Where are you?" "Verified machine control room. I figured out how to lock down their ship so they can't leave or call for backup. Also, I may have accidentally vented their shuttle bay to space, but I'm pretty sure nobody was in there." Legally speaking, Zracht knew he should probably be concerned about Emma's casual approach to life support systems. Emotionally speaking, he was discovering that pride was apparently another feeling he was capable of experiencing. "Emma," he said, "you realize you just trapped armed hostiles on a space station and then eliminated their escape route. Is that bad? I thought it was tactically sound. You taught me that when you were explaining why you always park your ship near the emergency exits." Zracht blinked. He had explained that during their earlier tour, and she had not only been listening, she had applied the lesson in a completely different context, with devastating effectiveness. "No," he said slowly, "that was very good. Very good indeed." As he made his way toward the maintenance section to retrieve his partner, Zracht found himself facing an uncomfortable truth. Somewhere between juice boxes and philosophical discussions about stuffed animal politics, he had stopped thinking of Emma as cargo to be delivered. She wasn't a target anymore, or a responsibility, or even just a traveling companion. She was family, and family, as he was rapidly learning, changed everything. Zracht found Emma in the maintenance control room, surrounded by holographic displays that showed every system on the station. She had somehow managed to access security protocols that should have required administrative clearance, and was currently watching multiple camera feeds with the focused attention of a military strategist. "There are 12 more of them," she reported without looking up from the displays. "They're trying to cut through the blast doors I sealed, but it's going to take them at least 20 minutes with the equipment they brought. Also, their boss just arrived." "Their boss." Emma pointed to one of the screens, which showed the station's main docking bay. A sleek black vessel had just finished connecting to the airlock, and as Zracht watched, a figure in elaborate robes stepped onto the station. Even through the grainy security feed, there was something familiar about the way the newcomer moved. "That's the voice guy," Emma said matter-of-factly. "He smells even worse in person." The robed figure was flanked by 2 more soldiers, but these were clearly a different class of professional than the boarding party. Their armor was more advanced, their weapons more sophisticated, and their movements carried the kind of casual confidence that came from never having lost a fight. "Emma," Zracht said slowly, "I need you to get to my ship. Now. This situation just became significantly more dangerous." "No way," Emma said, finally turning away from the displays to give him a look that was surprisingly stern for someone who barely reached his waist. "We're partners, remember? Partners don't abandon each other when things get scary." "Partners also don't let their teammates walk into situations they can't handle," Zracht countered. But even as he said it, he knew he was fighting a losing battle. Emma had that expression humans got when they'd made up their minds about something, and he was learning that arguing with a determined human child was like trying to negotiate with a supernova. "Besides," Emma continued, "I have a plan. Your plan nearly got us killed 20 minutes ago." "My plan saved our lives 20 minutes ago," Emma corrected. "And it's going to work even better this time because now I know exactly what kind of bad guys we're dealing with." Before Zracht could ask what she meant by that, Emma had already started manipulating the control panels with the kind of systematic precision that suggested she understood the station's systems better than most of the people who worked there. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to go meet with the Voy guy and pretend like you're still planning to hand me over. I'm going to use the maintenance tunnels to get into position, and when things go bad, which they definitely will, because he's not planning to pay you, I'm going to implement what I call the nuclear option." "The nuclear option?" Emma's smile was bright and innocent and absolutely terrifying. You know how mining stations have really big explosives for breaking up asteroids? Zrakto felt his blood pressure spike. Emma, no! Emma, yes. Don't worry, I'm not actually going to blow up the station. I'm just going to make him think I will. Humans are really good at bluffing, and adults are really bad at figuring out when kids are lying. She was already heading for the maintenance access tunnel, moving with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested this conversation was over whether he agreed with her plan or not. Emma, Zrakth called after her, if something goes wrong, then you'll figure out how to fix it, she said confidently. That's what partners do. And then she was gone, leaving Zraktha alone with the uncomfortable realization that he was about to walk into a confrontation with unknown hostiles while his backup was a 6-year-old human with access to industrial mining equipment. This was either going to be the most successful con job in galactic history or the shortest partnership on record. 15 minutes later, Zraktha stood in the station's main cargo bay, facing the robed figure who had hired him. Up close, his employer was even more unsettling than the security footage had suggested. There was something fundamentally wrong about the way he moved, as if he were wearing someone else's body and hadn't quite figured out how all the parts worked together. Zrak the Bone Crusher, the figure said, and his voice carried the same synthetic quality it had over the communication system. I trust the retrieval was successful? The child is secure, Zrath replied, which was technically true if you considered secure to mean currently rigging mining explosives in the station's power core. Excellent. And the collateral damage? Minimal. Also technically true, since 3 dead soldiers and some structural damage to the corridors was probably considered a light day by bounty hunter standards. The robed figure nodded approvingly. You have exceeded expectations. The child will be most useful for our research. Something cold settled in Zrakt's stomach. Research. Human children possess certain unique neurological characteristics that our scientists find fascinating. Their brain chemistry is remarkably adaptable, and their capacity for forming emotional bonds can be quite easily exploited for our purposes. Zraktha's hand moved toward his weapon, but the 2 elite soldiers flanking his employer immediately shifted their stances in response. Whatever these people were planning for Emma, it definitely wasn't adoption into a loving family. Where is the child? The robed figure asked, looking around the empty cargo bay. Safe, Zrakth said, and something in his tone must have conveyed more than he intended, because the soldiers' weapons were suddenly trained on him. I see, his employer said, and there was something like disappointment in that synthesized voice. You have developed an attachment. How predictably human of you. I'm not human. No, but you have been exposed to human influence for an extended period. Their capacity for emotional manipulation is quite remarkable. The child has convinced you that she is worth protecting, despite the fact that she is merely a resource to be exploited. The robed figure gestured to his soldiers. Kill him. The child will cooperate once she realizes her protector is dead. The soldiers raised their weapons, and Zraktha prepared to die fighting, because that seemed like the kind of thing a good partner would do. But before anyone could pull a trigger, the station's public address system crackled to life. Attention bad guys! Emma's voice echoed through the cargo bay with the kind of cheerful authority that somehow made her sound like she was announcing a school assembly rather than delivering an ultimatum. This is Emma, and I have something to tell you. Zrak's employer looked around in confusion, clearly not expecting to be addressed by his intended research subject. First, Emma continued, Zappy is my friend, and friends don't let friends get shot by creepy voice guys. Second, I've spent the last 15 minutes learning about mining station safety protocols, and it turns out there are a lot of really interesting things you can do with industrial equipment if you're creative. The lights in the cargo bay flickered ominously. Third, Emma said, and now her voice carried a note of steel that reminded Zrak uncomfortably of hardened military commanders he'd known. I've just armed every single mining charge on this station and connected them to a dead man's switch. If anything happens to Zappy, or if you try to take me anywhere I don't want to go, I'm going to turn this entire facility into the galaxy's most expensive firework. The robed figure looked genuinely startled. She's bluffing. Human children don't have the technical knowledge to... Would you like to test that theory? Emma asked sweetly. Because I should probably mention that human children also don't have a very good understanding of consequences, or self-preservation, or really any of the things that keep adults from doing incredibly stupid and destructive things. As if to emphasize her point, the station's mining klaxons began sounding, indicating that the automated systems had detected explosive charges in armed status. The sound was designed to make people evacuate immediately, and it was working exactly as intended on the soldiers, who were looking increasingly nervous about their current assignment. "You're bluffing," Zirax's employer repeated, but he sounded less certain than before. "Am I?" Emma asked. "Tell you what, let's find out together. Zappy, are you okay down there?" "I'm fine," Zirax called back, unable to suppress a note of pride in his voice. "Great. Okay, voice guy, here's the deal. You and your soldier friends are going to get back on your ship and leave. You're going to delete whatever information you have about me from your databases, and you're never going to bother Zappy or me ever again. And if we refuse?" There was a pause, and when Emma spoke again, her voice had all the innocent menace of a child who had just discovered that adults would believe almost anything if you delivered it with enough confidence. "Then I'm going to press this big red button that says emergency mining detonation, and we're all going to find out whether human children really are as crazy as everyone says we are." The mining klaxons grew louder, and somewhere in the distance, Zirax could hear the automated evacuation warnings beginning to play. Emma had somehow managed to convince an entire mining station that it was about to explode, and she was using that as leverage in a hostage negotiation with people who had military-grade weapons and decades of combat experience. It was absolutely insane. It was also working. "This is ridiculous," the robed figure said, but he was already backing toward the exit. "A human child cannot possibly—" "Bye-bye, voice guy," Emma interrupted cheerfully. "Thanks for visiting Mining Station Omega-7. Please don't come back." And then, because apparently Emma had been holding back during their earlier conversation, every single alarm on the station began sounding simultaneously. The lights shifted to emergency red, blast doors started sealing automatically, and the evacuation warnings became so loud that further conversation was impossible. Zirax's employer and his soldiers ran for their ship like the hounds of hell were chasing them, which, given Emma's current mood, might not have been far from the truth. As the black vessel undocked and jumped to hyperspace with what appeared to be unseemly haste, Zirax stood alone in the cargo bay and tried to process what had just happened. His 6-year-old partner had just successfully bluffed a group of armed professionals into abandoning their mission by threatening to blow up a mining station with explosives she probably couldn't actually detonate. She had done this while hiding in maintenance tunnels and using nothing but the public address system and an apparently encyclopedic knowledge of industrial safety protocols. "Zappy?" Emma's voice came over the intercom, sounding slightly less confident than it had during the negotiation. "Is it safe to come out now? Because I should probably mention that I wasn't entirely bluffing about the mining charges, and the automated systems are getting really upset about the safety violations." Zirax looked up at the nearest security camera and grinned, an expression that would have terrified anyone who didn't know him, but somehow seemed appropriate for the situation. "Come on down, partner," he said. "I think we need to have a conversation about your definition of reasonable risk assessment." But as Emma's laughter echoed through the intercom system, Zirax realized he didn't actually care about risk assessment or reasonable behavior or any of the professional standards that had governed his life for decades. He cared about the small human who had just saved both their lives using nothing but creativity, courage, and a complete disregard for conventional wisdom. And that, he was beginning to understand, was what family really meant. 6 months later, Zirax found himself in a situation that would have been completely unimaginable when he'd first accepted what he'd thought was a simple extraction job. He was sitting in the captain's chair of the Mercy's End, reviewing potential bounty contracts, while his business partner critiqued his professional choices from her custom-built workstation that had been installed next to his command console. "This one's boring," Emma announced, scrolling through the details of a fraud case involving embezzled mining rights. "White-collar crime is just rich people being stupid with math. Where are the interesting ones?" "Interesting ones tend to involve people shooting at us," Zirax pointed out, though he was already moving the frog case to the rejected pile. Emma's definition of boring had proven remarkably accurate over the past few months, and taking on mundane cases was a good way to waste time they could spend on more profitable ventures. "People always shoot at us anyway," Emma said with the casual pragmatism of someone who had been dodged plasma fire more times than most military veterans. "Remember that thing with the space pirates last month? They shot at us for like 3 hours, and that was supposed to be a simple debt collection." She had a point. Somehow, every job they took seemed to escalate into something significantly more complex than advertised. Zirax had initially blamed this on bad luck, but he was beginning to suspect that Emma's presence had a way of turning routine assignments into epic adventures. Possibly because she treated every new situation like a puzzle to be solved, and her solutions tended to involve creative applications of whatever explosive materials happened to be available. "What about this one?" Emma highlighted a missing person case involving a wealthy merchant's daughter who had disappeared from a resort planet. That sounds like it could be interesting. Zrak reviewed the details and immediately spotted several red flags. The client is offering triple rates for discretion and speed. The missing person was last seen arguing with her family about an arranged marriage, and the resort is in a system known for harboring runaway nobility. You're not actually missing, just hiding from parents who want to sell her to the highest bidder? Most likely. Emma leaned back in her chair, which had been specially designed to accommodate someone of her size while still allowing her to reach all the important controls. The sight of a 6-year-old human in a scaled-down flight suit, complete with her own utility belt full of what she called problem-solving tools, still struck Zrak as fundamentally absurd. But it was the kind of absurdity he'd grown comfortable with. We should take it, Emma decided. Rich families who try to force their kids into marriages are almost as bad as the creepy research people. Plus, resort planets usually have really good ice cream. Zrak found himself nodding along with his reasoning, which would have horrified his past self. 6 months ago, he would have chosen jobs based on profit margins and risk assessment. Now, he apparently selected cases based on moral considerations and frozen dessert availability. There is one small problem, he said. This particular client has specified that they want the target returned immediately, with no questions asked. They've also made it clear that they consider family business to be private business. Emma's expression shifted into what Zrak had learned to recognize as her tactical planning mode. So, we're going to have to be sneaky about the part where we don't actually hand her over to people who want to treat her like property. Very sneaky, and probably illegal in most systems. Good thing we're not in most systems then. Emma pulled up a star chart and began plotting a course to the resort planet. Besides, you taught me that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the same as the legal thing to do. That had been during a philosophical discussion about justice versus law that had somehow evolved from Emma asking why some planets had slavery while others considered it abhorrent. Zrak was still not entirely sure how he'd become responsible for a human child's moral education, but it seemed to be happening whether he planned it or not. There's something else, he said. This job is going to require us to blend in at a high-end resort. That means formal clothing, refined manners, and absolutely no explosions. Emma looked genuinely concerned about this. No explosions at all? What if there's an emergency? Then we handle it with subtlety and discretion. But explosions are so much more efficient. Zrak rubbed his temples, a gesture he'd picked up from watching human behavioral patterns. Emma, do you remember our conversation about appropriate responses to different types of problems? Yeah, you said that not every problem is a nail just because I'm really good with hammers. Exactly. This is a situation that requires finesse. Emma considered this for a moment, then brightened. Does finesse include the thing where I pretend to be a lost rich kid and you pretend to be my scary bodyguard while we gather intelligence? Absolutely. It is actually not a terrible plan. Ha! See? I can do finesse! Emma spun around in her chair with the kind of boundless energy that made Zrak wonder if human children came with built-in power generators. This is going to be fun. I've never been to a resort planet before. Do you think they have swimming pools? I've always wanted to try swimming. As she chattered about the various recreational activities she hoped to experience, Zrak found himself watching her with the kind of protective fondness that still sometimes caught him off guard. Somewhere along the way, this small human had completely reorganized his priorities without him noticing. His ship, which had once been a sterile showcase of professional intimidation, now contained colorful artwork taped to the walls, a collection of stuffed animals that served as crew morale officers, and a small library of children's books that Emma insisted were essential educational material. His reputation, which had once struck fear into the hearts of criminals across 3 galaxies, had evolved into something considerably more complex. He was still Zrak the Bone Crusher, but now he was also Emma's partner, Emma's protector, and according to one particularly colorful incident involving a corrupt customs official, Emma's father figure, who would absolutely destroy anyone who threatened his daughter. The communications console chimed with an incoming message, and Emma immediately perked up. Ooh, is that from the Corvanian freedom fighters? They said they might have a job for us. Emma, I've told you not to answer recruitment messages from revolutionary organizations. But they're the good kind of revolutionaries. They're fighting against oppressive mining cartels and unfair labor practices. Plus, their leader has really pretty scales, and she sent us cookies last time. Zrak pulled up the message and discovered that it was indeed from Commander Veltara of the Corvanian Resistance, and she had indeed included a digital gift basket along with her job offer. The Corvanians had become regular clients after Emma had somehow convinced their entire leadership council that human children were excellent tactical consultants. "She wants us to help liberate a labor camp," Emma reported, reading over his shoulder. "That sounds way more interesting than the resort thing. Can we do both? The jobs are in opposite sectors of the galaxy. So we do the resort thing first, then swing by Corvanian space for the liberation. It's efficient time management." Zraktha looked down at his partner, who was currently planning a schedule that involved high society infiltration followed immediately by armed revolution, and realized that this was just his life now. He was a bounty hunter who specialized in morally complex cases, traveled with a human child who treated interstellar conflict like an educational field trip, and apparently maintained professional relationships with multiple revolutionary organizations. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it was the most fulfilling work he'd ever done. "Fine," he said, because arguing with Emma about their itinerary was an exercise in futility. "Resort first, revolution second, but we're packing extra medical supplies, and you're not allowed to befriend any more rebel leaders until we finish the jobs we've already committed to." "Deal," Emma said, then paused, thoughtfully. "But what if the rebel leaders befriend me first? Because technically that's different from me befriending them." Emma: "Right, sorry. No new revolutionaries until we're done with the current revolutionaries." As she turned back to her workstation to begin planning their upcoming adventures, Zraktha reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been a solitary predator with a simple business model: find target, collect target, deliver target, collect payment. Now he was part of a 2-person operation that seemed to specialize in complicated moral dilemmas and creative problem-solving. His fellow bounty hunters, on the rare occasions when he encountered them, seemed to find his new partnership both baffling and slightly concerning. The idea of working with a human child struck most of them as either insane or suicidal, and they couldn't understand why someone with his reputation would choose to complicate his life with ethical considerations and family responsibilities. But they hadn't seen Emma talk a corrupt planetary governor into confessing his crimes by asking increasingly uncomfortable questions about his childhood. They hadn't watched her convince a gang of space pirates to abandon their criminal careers by offering them legitimate employment with better benefits. And they definitely hadn't experienced the particular terror of having a 6-year-old human look them in the eye and calmly explain exactly why their life choices were morally indefensible. Emma had a way of making people want to be better than they were. It was possibly the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy, and she wielded it with the casual confidence of someone who genuinely believed that everyone was capable of choosing to do the right thing if they just thought about it hard enough. "Zappy," Emma said, interrupting his philosophical musings. "I've been thinking about something. That's always concerning. What now?" "Well, you know how we're really good at helping people who are stuck in bad situations?" "Yes. And you know how there are probably lots of other kids out there who need help but don't have anyone to protect them?" Zraktha felt a familiar sense of impending complexity. "Emma, what exactly are you suggesting?" Emma turned to face him with the kind of expression that meant she'd been planning something elaborate and was only now ready to share the details. "I think we should expand our business model. Instead of just taking random bounty hunting jobs, we should specialize in cases involving kids who need rescuing, like a combination family services agency and heavily armed intervention team." "You want to turn us into professional child rescuers?" "Think about it. We're already really good at dealing with bad guys who hurt kids. We have all the right equipment, and we know how to make adults listen when they're being stupid about important things." Emma's enthusiasm was building momentum, which was usually a sign that she'd already worked out most of the practical details. Plus, kids are way better at spotting which adults are trustworthy than most people think. "We could build a whole network." Zraktha looked at his partner, who was currently sketching organizational charts on her datapad while explaining her vision for a galaxy-spanning child protection service run by a reformed bounty hunter and a human 6-year-old with a disturbing talent for creative violence. It was absolutely insane. It was also exactly the kind of thing that would probably work, because Emma had a gift for taking impossible ideas and making them seem not only feasible but inevitable. "We'll need better insurance," he said finally. Emma's grin was bright enough to power a small space station. "So that's a yes?" Zraktha looked around his ship, taking in the cheerful chaos that had replaced his formerly pristine professional environment. Stuffed animals perched on weapon racks, children's drawings were taped next to tactical displays. His intimidating captain's chair now had a booster seat attachment, so Emma could reach the controls during flight operations. 6 months ago, he would have considered this the complete destruction of everything he'd worked to build. Now he realized it was actually an upgrade. "Yes," he said, "but we're still doing the resort job first. and you're not allowed to adopt any more revolutionary movements until we get the child rescue service properly organized. What about if the revolutionary movements adopt me? Emma. Okay. No new political affiliations until we launch the rescue service. But can we at least send a nice card to the Corvanian freedom fighters? It's important to maintain professional relationships. As Emma began composing what she called a diplomatic correspondence to their various rebel contacts, Zrakth settled back in his captain's chair and prepared for the next phase of their partnership. Somewhere out there in the galaxy, there were probably children who needed help, corrupt officials who needed intimidating, and various bad guys who were about to discover that threatening kids was a remarkably poor life choice. It was going to be complicated, dangerous, and probably illegal in at least half the known systems. He couldn't wait to get started. After all, when your partner was a human child with unlimited imagination and a complete disregard for conventional wisdom, boring was never really an option anyway.